So this is a conversation with Jack Sapoch. He's the coordinator of No Name Kitchen's Border Violence Reporting, which is itself part of the Border Violence Monitoring Network. We spoke about the EU's policy of violence against asylum seekers on the so-called Balkan route, and how the monitoring network partners have been trying to document it and support those being victimized by it. Topics also covered include the role of the Croatian government and other governments on the so-called Balkan route, EU-funded and/or supported borderization processes which violates the rights of asylum seekers, the lack of awareness by EU citizens of this Balkan route, and how the monitoring network uses open source investigations like that used by Bellingcat and Forensic Architecture to uncover these abuses. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FireTheseTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you.
My name is Jack Sapoch. I work with the organization, the grassroots organization No Name Kitchen, which is a humanitarian project that has several different bases throughout the Balkan route in Greece, in Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia. And within this organization, I focus on coordinating our border violence reporting efforts. So speaking to people who return back from transit attempts along the border, refugees and migrants on the Balkan route who have stories of abuse or violence from mainly EU authorities. And No Name Kitchen is just one of the many organizations in the region who collaborate under this collective banner called the Border Violence Monitoring Network. And together we basically have this collective platform for border violence advocacy, because so many of the issues related to border violence along the Balkan route are very closely tied together with each other, no matter which border they're taking place on. Yeah, over the past just about 3 years now, this has been work that we've been doing together along with several other of our partner organizations.
Okay, so let's just start with like a general timeline, I suppose. So like when and why was the Border Violence Monitoring Network, just to give our listeners like some background, if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. As I was saying, this is very much a grassroots response to the issues that volunteers and activists were facing, or rather seeing, in the Balkans, starting in the summer and fall of 2017. So this is in part a reaction to the closure of the borders in the Balkans in March 2016. In which case these practices, which have been going on for a long time but became quite prominent, quite visible, starting after the border closures, first on the border between Hungary and Serbia, and then later shifting more towards the border between Croatia and Serbia. But yeah, so in the fall winter of 2017, No Name Kitchen, along with a grassroots organization named Regardu, which was working in Subotica, Serbia at the time. No Name Kitchen was in Šid, Croatia, or Serbia. And yeah, they basically started saying, okay, we're working with these people, we're seeing these people every day who are being terribly affected by this violence, by these illegal pushbacks, and started very, very much, informally collecting these reports to try and do something with them. And over time, these efforts have become, much more structured. The platform has grown to include a number of other organizations, focusing on a number of other borders as the border violence shifts and evolves along the Balkan route, as it does, as a response to EU policies and pressures. So now the point that we are as a network now, we focus on the Croatian-Bosnian border, Croatian-Serbian border, the Serbian borders with Romania and Hungary, but also further south down in Greece, looking at the Evros region, looking at pushbacks from Italy to Patras, looking at more recently issues of border violence in Albania and Montenegro and Macedonia. Basically trying to provide the link, providing a mutual platform that looks at this violence as a phenomenon and is able to analyze it and track it over time as it shifts and evolves.
So the heart of the issue here, or at least the method that it's being carried out with, is like these pushbacks that you're talking about. And pushbacks, for those who don't know, is, I mean, quite literally, they push these people back. So they push them from one part of the border to another part of the border. I was reading this recent report that you guys put out, and I'll read just the first paragraphs, just to sort of like ground our listeners even more to the extent of the problem that we'll be talking about here. So I'm quoting here. More than 7 reports published on the database borderviolence.eu document the experiences of a total of more than 7,000 asylum seekers who have been illegally expelled from Croatia in recent years. In many of these so-called pushbacks, the persons concerned were deported from the EU to Serbia or Bosnia-Herzegovina, even across several national borders. In 80% of the cases, there are indications of disproportionate use of force, up to cases of torture by Croatian officials, and 38% of those affected are minors. For thousands of people seeking protection who want to continue their refuge to Western and Central Europe via Greece, the Balkan region represents a politically intended impasse. And end quote. Sorry. And the last bit, what I want to focus on a bit, because you do say politically intended impasse, and that's of course true. But what do you mean by politically intended impasse for those who may not really know the region, or for that matter, maybe the EU's policies in recent years?
It's a big impasse to talk about, but when we talk about this, when we talk about pushbacks, when we talk about collective expulsion, when it relates very heavily to EU policies and interests in the region, that wrapped up in this issue, you have systematic denials of access to asylum, that people who cross these borders and express an intention to claim asylum to Croatian authorities, Hungarian authorities, Slovenian authorities, which they have the right to do, they're arbitrarily denied that process and on the spot by these police officers who are not entitled to make this decision on the spot. They're loaded into vans and driven to secluded areas of the border in the middle of woods at nighttime, taken out of the vans one by one, surrounded by men in black balaclava masks, and beaten and told to walk over the border into a country that there's no proof that they were even in the first place. Wrapped up in this, you have what border scholars call prevention through deterrence. So this is wrapped up in this physical violence. But more than that, we can talk about immense material violence along the borders, that perhaps more so than broken bones and bruises on their body. People come back from these pushbacks, from the transit attempts, with their phones broken, systematically broken, their power banks, their shoes, having their shoelaces taken out of them, their sleeping bags burnt, their backpacks having the straps cut off of them, thrown into near freezing waterways along the border. And these are things that enact a physical toll, for sure, that if you're thrown into a freezing waterway and you have to walk back 10 kilometers back to the nearest camp, that this means that you have to wait some time to get better. If your bones are broken, you have to wait to get better and heal before trying to cross the border again. But the insidious nature of this material violence is that these authorities are also achieving this goal of deterrence, of making it more difficult, of enacting higher taxes, shall we say, of trying to cross this border and claim asylum in EU countries. And so every phone that's broken, every personal ID that is taken, this takes time and money and efforts to replace. So there may not be physical barriers separating the European Union between Croatia and non-European Union Bosnia, but the physical and material, and in many cases psychological violence that refugees and migrants risk when crossing these borders certainly creates a political impasse that is in many ways funded and approved by EU leaders. That the Croatian state, for example, has received hundreds of millions of euros in the past 10 years to purchase the technological equipment that they use to hunt and track down refugees and migrants crossing over the border. And that has been used to great effect to communicate this violence onto these people.
The fact that we're talking about Well, in that report, for example, that I quoted before, like at least 7,000 asylum seekers treated this way, um, suggests, I mean, pretty obviously that there is at the very least complicity through silence at the highest levels, but at the worst, active complicity. I've so far written 2 or 3 articles, essays on this topic, and that last one was just a few months ago when there was the recent violence on the Turkish-Greek border. And for those who don't know, Ursula von der Leyen basically said she essentially complimented the Greek border guard and called them an aspida, like the shield, using this very, very warlike language, essentially. And I know that Donald Tusk, for example, who is president of the European Council, he remarked a few times as well along those lines. And the point I'm trying to get at is, as you mentioned as well, that there is pretty much active complicity, and this is something that I personally, and I'm sure many activists in your network as well are trying to do, is to actually highlight the fact that this is not just some irregular, fascists who are going on the hunt for some migrants, which these also exist, of course, but there is actually active complicities from the upper echelons of the EU here. So, like on that note, how has the monitoring network, like to the extent that it's been possible, how have they tried to appeal to the EU or to try and campaign, release statements? I've read some of them. I quoted one of them before. And has there been any reaction from the EU so far, or not really?
Yeah, I think that in the past year, we've really increased our ability to conduct advocacy on that level. And part of that, a really large part of that, goes in thanks to the Border Violence Monitoring Network's advocacy team, which is, has been created within the last year to specifically try and tackle this issue of advocacy at higher levels in the European Union. And through that, we've been able to foster some connections within the European Parliament, within the Libe Committee. And one action that we had that we were able to coordinate in January was printing out images of people that we've spoken to, that we've collected reports with, and having members of the Libe Committee actually bring them and raise questions to Davor Božinović, the Croatian Interior Minister, when he's speaking before this committee, raising questions about the denials to asylum, the numerous examples of inhuman treatment and torture that have taken place in Croatia along the EU's external border. In addition to this, more recently, just this past week, actually, members of our advocacy team who are focused more on Germany at the moment because of Germany's position within the European Union, but B, strong cultural ties, cultural importance in Croatia that dates back a long time. Writing an open letter in response to what has been the German state's support, tacit support, in some cases explicit support of the Croatian state's border regime. And I think that a good example of that is that in January, the German Ministry of the Interior delivered like 300,000 euros worth of infrared camera equipment to the Croatian state. And more than that, within the past 8 months, there's been 2 joint trainings between the Germans and Croatians of other EU like state authorities in training on border procedures. Going back to 2018, Angela Merkel actually said that the Croatian state is doing a fantastic job and that she wouldn't change a single thing about the way that they are enforcing the border. And I think that really underscores, I think that sometimes within these discourses, there's kind of an ugly assumption that, these people in Southeastern Europe, in the Balkans, these Croatians, these Hungarians, Romanians, Macedonians, they're so violent, and it's because their police are such terrible people. And I think on some levels I wouldn't disagree with that statement, but leaving it at that really leaves out so much of the nuance and the integrated nature of the borders in Southeastern Europe. and the way that they're enforced, because it is integrated with the interests and the support of EU member states throughout the entire union.
So can you talk on that same note, can you talk about the I mean, to the best of your ability, about the what is this phenomenon of borderization or even re-borderization for those who don't know?
So the borderization in the Western Balkans, in the southeastern in Europe, it's not necessarily a new phenomenon, because it ties in with EU accession procedures, that a big part of the Croatian state's interest in protecting the European Union external border ties in with their interest in joining the Schengen zone. That's been a stated goal of the Croatian state in upholding this border. But further than that, you have borderizations in the Balkans, which are tying in not even with EU member states, but just prospective EU member states. That in these trainings that were organized between the Croatian and German state, some of the participants in it were authorities from Bosnia and Montenegro, states that are not members of the European Union, but are prospective members. And in order to fulfill the requirements of being able to join one day, the implicit understanding is that you need to protect and you need to construct borders in the same way that we do in the European Union. And I think that, so this borderization process in the Balkans, it's visible, highly visible in some ways, between Hungary and Serbia, where there have been fences erected between Slovenia and Croatia. There have been fences erected. But in much of the rest of the Balkans, it's been violent, and it's been physically manifested, but not in such a visible way, but more looking towards borders of technology, borders of this material violence that we were discussing before. That in the border between Croatia and Bosnia, they call it, in the local language, they call it the green border. Yeah. And it alludes to the fact that, there is no fence, but there is cameras, there's thermal cameras that are, and motion tracking cameras that can sense when people walk across them. That in the past 2 months, along sections of the Croatian-Bosnian border, there's been kilometers of forest cut between the two countries to better be able to control and monitor when people cross them. And I think that's a really interesting point to understand, that there's not fences being erected, but truly borders are becoming much more rigid and much more important, I think, to the states in the Balkans.
Yeah, I have. Sorry, I'll repeat that. I've been looking at these bordering practices essentially, and in academic terms, these can be anything from like very concrete fences and walls and so on. And but in other cases, it's more about like the cost, increasing the cost essentially of crossing a border, even if the border is not, let's say, delineated, or if it's one of those green borders like you mentioned. And I really wanted us to highlight this a bit, because I do believe that it's misunderstood. And I think the reason why it's misunderstood, maybe one of the reasons why it's misunderstood, is that part of us doesn't want to believe maybe that it can be this cruel and this well thought out, but the facts are what they are. And there's even a report that was excuse me, there's even a report that was released on the Monitoring Network's website on torture being practiced against asylum seekers. And I actually have a quote here that I'll just read. In 2019, our seminal investigation on the use of torture against refugees and migrants found that 80% of case reports of illegal pushback along the Balkan migration routes contained one, or in most cases, multiple features of violence indicating either torture or cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatments. To date in 2020, and this was like just a few weeks ago, to date in 2020, that percentage has increased, with our preliminary investigation having identified that 86% of all reports contain such features. So in other words, like this is there by design. In order to inflict higher costs, in order to have this policy of basically will make it so bad that they wouldn't even want to come here, because that's basically the the mission statement, or unofficially anyway. That's what is required essentially, if that's what they want to do. So I guess what I'm trying to get at, and I'm sorry, this I'll just say this as well, and like between parentheses, like this is a topic that's not easy for me to discuss. I have friends who have Syrian friends who have gone through quite a lot of things trying to cross these borders. Some of them have succeeded, others have not. Others are in Turkey, for example, right now, and so on. But like, do you, and maybe this is more of a like subjective question, I suppose, but would you say that most people in Europe, in the EU, are actually aware of how cruel and violent it actually is at the borders? Or and it doesn't necessarily have to be a yes or no answer, it can be like more nuanced. And if yes or no, why? Basically, let's just put it this way.
I think, I think that in many ways this transit route to the Balkans is very much forgotten by people in Europe. I think that when most people in Europe think about migration to the EU, they think about the Greek islands, yes, and they think about the Central Mediterranean. But I don't think many people understand the routes that people are taking after going to the Greek islands or after crossing the Evros region into Greece from Turkey, because it's such a process, and it's such a painful and traumatic process for so many people. Unfortunately, this to like put into perspective why people travel on this route, even though it is so violent and it is so dangerous, and people die on it. 6 people have died in Croatian rivers alone in the month of June. But statistically speaking, it's the safest route if you compare it to crossing the Central Mediterranean or trying to cross from Morocco to Spain. That literally you have people coming from Morocco, coming from Algeria, all the way to Turkey, and then going through the Balkans into Italy. But yeah, completely, I don't think that people understand what it takes. I don't think people understand the sacrifices that people have made, are making to go through this route. And yeah, I think that's a big question mark of how to communicate that. I think that one thing stands out to me that a colleague of mine said to me a couple of years ago when talking about how to structure this advocacy, how to structure our efforts to make people aware at the highest levels, but also just to the general public, that these pushbacks are systematic, they're violent, they're shared throughout the borders of the Balkans. And he was saying that, what do you do when, people in Europe have become normalized to the death of hundreds of people in the Central Mediterranean every year? How are you going to make them, turn your head to a story of people getting beaten and then returned back to countries, the Western Balkans? And for me, I think that is a question mark still in some senses. But to answer your question, no, I don't think that people understand the roots whatsoever.
Yeah.
How could you?
No, I think I do agree. It's more of an open question for me. So, like, regardless of what your answer would have been, I would still be asking myself that question in a sense, because for the most part, the times that I've had conversations with folks, first I was in the UK first, now I'm in Switzerland, about these things for the most part, and I can say this from even family members who are Europeans, there is a total denial of how bad it actually is. They either don't believe that, they may have this unfortunate romanticization of cops or for border police or whatnot, and they think that they would never purposefully be cruel, but that they might just be. Sometimes I like the way I picture it, or I try to imagine what they're picturing in a sense is, you have a bunch of people at the border and they're telling these migrants, please don't come in. And then these migrants insist, and then so they push them back. And so they think it's just that simple, essentially. Not, I mean, and that's putting aside the fact that they would think that it's okay to push them back, of course, because that is an underlying belief that's still very present, unfortunately. to bring it back to sort of like more concrete grounds, I suppose there is an investigation that I think I'm not sure if you've released it yet, but can you talk to us a bit more about? So on March 23rd, 2020, Croatian police once again illegally forced 15 refugees to cross the Bosnian border. So these illegal pushbacks that we've been talking about. Can you talk to us a bit about that investigation, maybe the context, and what does it represent, maybe more broadly?
This is the investigation that I sent to you on Vimeo.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is something that we're ongoing and we haven't released yet, and I won't go into it too much because it's a bit case sensitive until we publish it.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it's worth saying that this pushback that we're talking about, in which case we have collected pretty unusual amount, shall we say, of materials related to this pushback. So videos and images, witness testimonies. Like so many others, it was violent. It took place in this small village around 10 kilometers away from the closest urban center. These men had been walking in Croatia for 4 days and were outside of the city of Karlovac in Croatia, were apprehended by a group of police officers, were taken to a police station, processed, and then driven in several vans back to this section of the Bosnian-Croatian border, and brought out and were met by these men who were wearing black balaclava masks, holding large tree branches, and beaten. And when they initially were apprehended, they had their shoes taken from them, their jackets taken from them, and barefoot were made to run into this river away from this violence, that this river that separates Croatia and Bosnia. And yeah, the material that we've collected is really heartbreaking in that sense, that it's showing these men who have been beaten and forced to run into this river, soaking wet without shoes on, crying and confused as to why this happened to them, why they had their phones and money stolen from them, why they were beaten so badly. And yeah, this happened at the height of the spread of coronavirus in Europe. And it's just one of, again, thousands of cases of pushbacks that have taken place along this border in this year alone. Really, that when we're talking about 7,000, that you brought up this number at the beginning of our talk, but that's just the number of people that we've spoken to, and I can't imagine that we speak to more than 5% of pushbacks. So really, we're talking about tens of thousands of these procedures that occur, or rather tens of thousands of people who've been affected by these procedures. But I do think when we're talking about a 3-year span, we can talk of tens of thousands of individual cases of pushbacks. And again, as we were saying, that every person who goes through this picks up their own trauma, that 5 years from now, this is a point in their life that they will remember and that they will be scared of. That you talk with people who have passed through this route, that are now, in the asylum process in Belgium, or, going through the process in Germany or wherever, they still have nightmares of hearing helicopters go over them at night. They still have like traumatic responses to being alone in forested areas, because they've been through this nightmare scenario in some cases 5, 10, 20 times of trying these games, coming back, being beaten up, trying again. And yeah, again, as we were saying, how could you just begin to understand that? How could I, who have never been through this, begin to understand that truly what it means? And it's quite perplexing then how you can ask, how can the European public as a whole understand this? Just to go back to your point about torture that you brought up, I think that another worthwhile case to point out that got some quite large traction, within Europe as a whole, at the beginning of May was this case of 3 pushback groups between a 1-week window in this exact same area of the border of this video case that we were just talking about. Maybe like 500 meters away from where this other group got pushed back. There were 3 groups over the span of 7 days who were apprehended within the Croatian interior, and before they were pushed back, officers, Croatian officers took, cans of spray paint, orange spray paint, and crossed like X's onto their heads to mark them in some way with a motivation that I truly cannot understand. Marking them as animals, maybe marking them maybe with crosses on their head. It's really difficult to say, but this case, we were able to bring it to The Guardian initially, which got quite a large response, not only just from the general public, but also from EU Parliament members. From the Croatian state, they actually wrote a press release regarding it, of course, denying that it took place whatsoever, denying that there were officers deployed to the border at all. But now that's actually a case that hopefully will go through Croatian courts and hopefully some light, or ideally some repercussions or consequences will become of it. But yeah, it's I really pause when I think of how many cases there are and how many like people have go through this, and how impossible it is for these people to see justice for it. That within the transit communities along the Balkan route, violence is normalized to such a high degree that it's difficult sometimes to actually get people to talk about it, because they see it as normal. They see it as something that is natural for people to cross borders, to receive these beatings, to take on this trauma. And for me, that's maybe the most frustrating, maybe the most scary thing to really think about.
Yeah, how it gets normalized through the processes themselves. I can imagine that most people, when they think of these borders again, they might think because of some of these reports, including yours, of the helicopters or armed men following them and that kind of thing. But we're also talking about like electronic sensors, electric wires, helicopters, drone patrols, heat sensors that you mentioned. Can you give us like a kind of a picture, like paint a picture as much as you can of like the entire infrastructure? Of course, maybe all of it is not possible, but like a part of it. And along those same lines, so like a question that's similar to this one is, a few weeks ago, I had Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat on to talk about like some of the open source investigative techniques that they use to expose crimes, or like even just find out what's happening in a certain situation. And from what I could tell from the video that you sent me and possibly others, there are these similar techniques that are not being used, like these kind of open source investigative techniques,
Mm-hmm.
to just find out what's going on. So can you talk a bit about that? Because it's very important. What I'm trying to do as well with the podcast is not just to tell people that, well, this is a bad thing. Obviously, this is a bad thing. That's more than obvious, but that there are concrete things that people can do to investigate it. Maybe investigate is a more difficult thing, but I don't know. It may not be. I mean, I can imagine that someone in the Balkans or in Greece or in Turkey or whatnot, in those bordered areas for refugees or for migrants, that there are tools at their disposal that they may not be aware of, if that makes sense.
I mean, just first to talk briefly about the understanding the technologies that are deployed along the border. That's something that. Okay, so I'm trying to think best how to answer this question. First, when we started doing this work within the Border Violence Network, within No Name Kitchen, I think that the volunteers, the people who started doing this, we were doing it as best as we could at the time with the tools that we had, with the understanding that we had. But looking back on it, I think that we did fall into some pitfalls of not being able to analyze or understand the violence that we were seeing on a day-to-day basis. of leaving it at, okay, these Hungarian police officers did bad things, it's really bad, and they are supported by the European Union, but not really being able to unpack that point. And I think that within the last year, that's something that we've really invested on and upskilled our capacity to analyze and eloquate to people that we're talking to within these conversations. I think that the technology is a great point there, because it's one of the most crucial aspects of how this process of violence between Croatia and Bosnia, Serbia and Hungary, Serbia and Romania, Greece and Turkey is able to be so effective that people are able to be hunted down by these authorities and beaten and returned like such a machine, that it really relates to this technology. And almost all of that, at least in Croatia, which I can speak to because that's the context that I work in the most and that I understand the most, that this is funded directly by the European Union, that the thermal cameras are purchased with money from the European Union's internal security fund, that even down to English language classes for people in Croatia who are engaged in these processes were purchased with the European Union's Schengen facility funding. That you have, every 6 months you have a new round of funding that gets delivered, and it's used to make the Croatian state more effective in identifying and then returning these people. And the violence remains constant, no matter how much more technology is acquired or how little is used. The technology just makes it more effective to do that to more people. And yeah, so I think that as we've begun to upskill our capacity to understand and to eloquate these points, the integrated nature of border enforcement in the southeastern Europe, we've begun to develop more tools or require more tools to link those together. I think that, for the past 3 years, one of the key outputs of the Border Violence Monitoring Network has been our database, which is an open source, publicly available database of every report that we collect from people, from refugees and migrants and asylum seekers who we talk to on a day-to-day basis, who are returning back from the border with these testimonies. And we have more than 700 cases on this database, which has hard points like date, timing, location, number of officers, number of people involved, where they're from, but also includes open narratives of this abuse as told to us by the people that we're talking to. And I think that's great. I think that's one of the things that I'm super proud of within this network, because it's completely unique. But one of the weak points that I think within our work has been that has been the end point for a lot of these reports. But as I was saying, as we've been beginning to want to answer more difficult questions, more complicated questions, we've had to seek out and teach ourselves how to use more complicated tools. And I think that the work of Bellingcat and forensic architecture in particular has been extremely inspiring for us to see these OSINT, these open source investigations that really only require access to the internet and a laptop to make use of.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's been really inspiring for us to start to delve into more, because I think a year and a half ago, if we received a video of a pushback that had like Croatian police officers in it or EU authorities in it, we would publish it, we'd put it out on the internet, and maybe that would be it, that we could say, okay, this many refugees were pushed back and this is where it happened. But when you begin to understand the tools that you have in front of you, these open source investigative tools, you start to be able to do so much more with these seemingly very small pieces of information. Like, for instance, if you see a police officer who is captured in this video, well, there is so much information there. If you're savvy with Google Translate, even if you don't speak the local language, you can start looking, okay, where did this take place? Okay, took place in this county in Croatia, where there's only 3 border police stations in this county. Okay, this place took place within this jurisdiction. So there's only 25 police officers who work within this jurisdiction, and I can find one of them on Facebook, and if you find one of them on Facebook, then you can look at their friends, who they're probably friends with their coworkers, and from there you can start to identify the specific police officers that are featured in this video. Things like 3D modeling using open source animation programs to recreate pushback scenes and better identify the exact geolocation of the video. It really feels like opening a door and walking into an entirely different room from what we have been doing, because it really allows us to stretch our information much further. And it's something that I think that, at least for me, I'm only beginning to understand and only beginning to learn how to use effectively. But I think that within the next year, that's definitely something that we are going to continue to work on, and hopefully develop some strategic partnerships in that sense with people within the open source investigative field who have been doing this for a while, to mentor us and to allow us to learn from them, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also trying to get into it slowly, but I haven't managed yet. But these tools are, as I said, I interviewed Elliot Higgins on the podcast a few weeks ago. So for people who are listening who are more interested in finding out these tools, they can go back to that. Last point before kind of closing in, and I'll ask you when we close in to just mention like how can people support the monitoring network. I wanted to ask you if you can talk a bit about the website itself, and like what can people find if they go on the website. For example, like I have it in front of me, so like the testimonies, reports, that kind of thing, just to give some sort of idea for people who want to find out more. And where can they follow, just general plugins, and if they want to help, how can they do so?
Yeah, so our website is borderviolence.eu. Again, the main output on this website is our database of 700 and growing individual case reports on pushbacks in the Balkans. But in addition to this, we come together, all of the different organizations within the network come together each month to look at the reports that we have produced within that given month, and to analyze the trends in border violence, and to provide some hard analysis of what we're seeing and what has changed in the last month. And again, if you're looking to follow us, we're on the Border Violence Monitoring Network is on Facebook, we're on Twitter. But in addition to this, there's a whole, community of organizations who are part of this network. So I work for No Name Kitchen, but in addition to this, we have Are You Serious? We have Center for Peace Studies, both in Croatia, InfoCop in Slovenia, Mobile Info Team in Greece. We have Collective Aid in Serbia. And we have two new partners, Jusor in Turkey and Mare Liberum in the Greek islands. We're a growing network, and I would say that if anybody's interested in helping us, any organizations are interested in joining, but also any individual people who are interested in working on these issues, reach out to us. We have contact information available on our website, borderviolence.eu. And there's so much work to do. Like I was saying, we're really expanding the amount of what we're doing. We're expanding the what we're doing is much more complicated than it was a year ago or 2 years ago, and we need more people to do it. So anybody who's interested is definitely welcome to reach out. Amazing.
Thank you a lot for your time. This has been really fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for your time too, Joey. It's nice to talk to you.